Not all learning and development teams look and operate the same. Some are big, some are small, and if you're new to the world of instructional design or e-learning, trust me, you'll want to know what type of team you're working on or might be working on. And that's exactly what I'll help you understand in this video. So stick around. Hey there folks, Tim Slade here from the eLearning Designers Academy. As I mentioned before, very few things are standardized in our industry. And this goes far beyond simply defining what instructional design is or what it means to be an instructional designer or e-learning developer. This lack of standardization also extends into how any given learning and development team is structured and how work flows through that team. Now, whether you're completely brand new to the world of instructional design or e-learning development, or maybe you're trying to get into it for the first time, you might be wondering why this information is important to understand. Well, to cut straight to the point, it's important because the structure of an L&D team has a direct correlation to the scope of work you might be responsible for as a member of that team, whether you're an instructional designer, an e-learning developer, a project manager, a facilitator, or a little bit of all of those things. When I've talked about what it is that instructional designers actually do on a day-to-day and project-by-project basis, I emphasized how some roles focus on the whole process of instructional design and development, and others are focused on a very specific component. And more often than not, this is due to the structure and size of the team those individuals are working on. Now, before I provide my overview of the different ways an L&D team might be structured, let me say this. What I'm about to share with you isn't going to be 100% true for every L&D team out there. There are always going to be exceptions. And what I'm sharing applies mostly to private sector organizations, companies, and corporations. So, with that all being said, let's get to it. Now, when we look at the ways a learning and development team might be structured, I like to visualize it in a simple matrix. Now, across the top here, an L&D team might be centralized or decentralized within the organization it serves. And along the side here, the people who work on that team might be generalists or specialists. Now, let's first take a look at what I consider the simplest of these two sets of variables, whether the team is centralized or decentralized. Now, depending on the size of the company or organization, you might have a single learning and development team which is designed to service the learning needs of the whole organization. And typically, these centralized teams sit within the human resources part of the organization. And of course, on the other hand, decentralized teams are when you have multiple, usually smaller learning and development teams scattered across the organization to serve different functions. For example, you might have an L&D team that sits within the human resources or organizational development departments, which focus on compliance training or leadership development. You might have an L&D team that's focused on sales enablement or another one on customer education and so forth and so on. A great example of this is when I first fell into e-learning and instructional design at Kohl's Department Stores, a major clothing retailer here in the United States. While Kohl's had a centralized L&D team within the HR department that focused mainly on company-wide learning initiatives, I sat on a dedicated team just for the loss prevention department, where I worked to design and develop learning and training solutions just for those employees within loss prevention, catching shoplifters. And of course, there were several other smaller L&D teams scattered throughout the organization, supporting various other functions of the company. Now, as we look at centralized or decentralized learning and development teams, why this information is important for you to know is that it'll typically have an effect on the types of projects that you actually work on as an instructional designer or e-learning developer. With centralized teams, you're more likely to work on a large variety of different projects, covering a wide range of topics and with many different subject matter experts. Whereas with decentralized teams, you're more likely to be working with a smaller number of subject matter experts focused on specific topics related to that part of the organization you're supporting. So that's centralized or decentralized L&D teams. And the major difference between the two is the scope of how you're supporting the company or organization. Let's now turn our attention to whether the people working on the L&D team are generalists or specialists. Now, it's this set of variables that are going to have the biggest impact not only on how work flows through the learning and development team as a whole, but also the scope of responsibility and the diversity of skill sets necessary for any individual to be effective on that team. There are a lot of different ways work and projects can flow through an L&D team. And the best way to understand how it relates to being a specialist or a generalist on a given team is to understand how much of the instructional design process a particular individual is responsible for on any given project they might work on. And when we talk about the instructional design process, I think the best way for us to look at it is by referring back to the 5 steps of the ADDIE model: analysis, design, development, implementation, and of course, evaluation. So let's start by looking at generalists. Generalists typically work on teams where each individual learning professional is responsible for the entire ADDIE process from beginning to end for any particular project they might work on. And that includes conducting a needs analysis, designing the learning solution, developing it, whether it's an in-person workshop, an e-learning course, a job aid, a video, or anything else in between, implementing and delivering it to the target audience of learners, and of course, evaluating the effectiveness of it. In other words, generalists need to be able to do a little bit of everything under the umbrella of instructional design. Now, typically, you see generalists on smaller L&D teams working and supporting smaller, sometimes less organizationally mature companies. But, that's not always the case. For example, when I worked at Kohl's, I worked on a decentralized L&D team. And as I mentioned earlier, I focused on supporting the learning and training efforts for the loss prevention department. And as a member of that team, I was a generalist responsible for all aspects of the projects assigned to me. I had to be my own project manager, my own graphic designer, my own e-learning developer, my own video editor, my own needs analyzer, my own implementer, and all of those things, depending on any given project I might have been working on at the time. Now, before we look at specialists, sometimes generalists are called full stack designers and developers. And that's a phrase that comes from the engineering world, which means that the individual is multidisciplinary and they can handle both the back-end design work and the front-end development work, and they can handle the whole ADDIE process for their own projects. Think of it like the Renaissance person of L&D. So that's what it means to be a generalist. Now, what about specialists? Well, a specialist is a learning professional who is typically responsible for a single or very specific part of the ADDIE process for a given project. And typically, people who work on teams like this manage their projects in an assembly line fashion. For example, you might have a lead instructional designer or learning program manager, a title that's becoming more and more popular these days, who is responsible for engaging with their stakeholders and SMEs to set the learning and training strategy for that part of the organization, along with conducting a needs analysis to identify performance issues. Now, from there, they typically pass the project off to an instructional designer to conceptualize and design the training solution. And the designer will usually work with the subject matter expert to collect content, create an action map, to align the training efforts back to measurable business goals, and draft a design document to propose the training solution. And in some instances, if an e-learning course or video or other type of multimedia is being designed, the instructional designer may also draft the storyboards or scripts for those assets. Now, from there, they would hand it off and start working with one or more developers to actually start building the training materials. This might include working with an e-learning developer to use a tool like Articulate Storyline to create the e-learning course, a video editor to create video content, a graphic designer to design graphics, and so forth and so on. And sometimes, depending on the capabilities or capacity of the team, these development functions might also be outsourced to one or more contractors or freelancers. Now, once all of the training content is developed, depending on the learning experience that was created, it'll usually get handed off to different individuals for implementation. For example, if what was created was an e-learning course, then it'll likely get handed off to a dedicated learning management system or LMS admin to publish and distribute the course throughout the organization. And of course, on the other hand, if it's an in-person workshop or an instructor-led training, then it might get handed off to a group of facilitators to deliver that training. And then finally, for evaluation, this might be when the lead instructional designer or learning program manager steps back into the project to measure and evaluate the effectiveness of the training that they initiated back at the beginning. And of course, they would report back to the stakeholders and SMEs that they were working with to continue iterating on the learning strategies for that team. So, as you can see, being a specialist requires much more focus on a given set of skills, but it's much more collaborative in terms of how a project goes from conception to completion throughout the team. Now, usually you'll see this sort of team structure in larger, more organizationally mature learning and development teams. And a great example is when I used to lead my instructional design team at GoDaddy. This is exactly how we would work through our projects. We had a dedicated team of program managers, my team of instructional designers, and another team of training facilitators. And between our three teams, this is how we work to support the organization. So that's the difference between being a generalist or a specialist. And the reason this is so important to know in terms of what type of team you might be working on is that it has a direct correlation to your scope of responsibility and skill set as a member of that team. You know, it's a lot like what I've talked about before with being a T-shaped learning professional and what skills you need to be an instructional designer. Generalists tend to have more broad capabilities, whereas specialists tend to be more focused on their given area of deep expertise. So that's an overview of the different ways a learning and development team might be structured, along with how work might flow through that team and the scope of responsibilities that you might be accountable for depending on your role within that team. And, you know, like I said at the start of the video, every L&D team is different. And whether you just landed your first instructional design or e-learning development job, or you're interviewing for one, this is something that you'll want to ask about and understand so that you can make sure your skills and interests align with the type of work that you might be doing on that team. So I want to know what you think. If you're currently working on an L&D team, regardless of your role or title, what does your team look like? Is it centralized or decentralized? Are you a generalist or a specialist on that team? Or if you're brand new to the industry or trying to get into it for the first time, what type of team do you see yourself working on and why? Share your thoughts, comments, questions by commenting down below. Otherwise, I want to thank you so much for watching. If you haven't done so already, make sure to click that like, subscribe, and bell button to get alerted the next time I publish a video just like this one. And of course, make sure to join us inside the eLearning Designers Academy with the link down in the comments, where we focus on helping new instructional designers and e-learning developers grow their careers by focusing on skills first. Otherwise, my name is Tim Slade, and until next time, I'll see you around.